Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 147. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. Swamp Thing is being directed by three mysterious people to go to Germany and battle the Parliament of Trees in the Black Forest. And the way that they kind of tricked him into going to Europe is they lured him to the Netherlands with a card that said that Linda Holland was still alive and that she was working as a prostitute in the red light district. So Swamp Thing had to investigate that. So he flew there, and on the way, the Green attacked and killed everybody in the plane that he was on. And he was able to survive. And luckily for him, it didn't crash land in the ocean or anything. It actually crash landed in the Netherlands. So Swamp Thing did make it there. He did check on Linda. She was alive, but she wasn't his real Linda. She was actually some sort of construct made by one of those three mysterious men out of a picture in a newspaper that he had. So she was like a fake version of Linda Holland and only had some of her memories. But Swamp Thing did get to have one last goodbye with her. So we got a little bit of closure with that. In the meantime, the government with Colonel Nelson is hot on Swamp Thing's trail. They have tracked him to the Netherlands, in Amsterdam specifically, and they are right around the block from where he's at right now. And last we left it, Swamp Thing was in a bar, and he had taken some drugs, and the drugs were causing his body to react violently. So vines were shooting out of him and wrapping around people, and the screams from that bar actually alerted the government that Swamp Thing was close by, and Colonel Nelson Strong burst into the bar with a flamethrower in hand, and that was where we left it off, with Colonel Strong looking at Swamp Thing and threatening to burn him alive. So first things first, with issue 147, we see Swamp Thing is lashing out at some government agents. He's got vines shooting out of his hands that are wrapping around their necks. And watching all of this in the background is a large face, but specifically two eyes that are coming out from some sort of hood. And the eyes actually have skulls for pupils, and the face is made of lumpy purple skin. And we also see that this issue is written by Mark Miller, with art by Phil Hester and Kim DeMolder. And as we turn to the first page, there's a text box that says Stamford, Connecticut, 1951. And we see a man in a neighborhood approaching a house, and he knocks on the door, and inside a woman goes to it but doesn't open right away. She calls out from behind it saying, "For goodness sake, Larry, it's almost midnight. The key's under the doormat. I must have told you 1,000,000 times." But as she opens the door, she sees a man that she doesn't recognize, and he says, "Miss Holland?" And she answers, "Yes, I'm Alice Holland. What's wrong? Has there been an accident?" And the man replies, "Not yet, doll. I'm here to prevent one. My name's Jim Corrigan. Can I come in?" And just in case you didn't know, Jim Corrigan is the human part of the Spectre. And he used to be a cop until he was killed, and then he came back as God's wrath or judgment in the spirit known as the Spectre. So Jim Corrigan just wears like a normal suit. He's a pretty standard looking Irish guy with red hair, but he's got stripes of white in it. So once Jim introduces himself, surprisingly, Alice actually lets him in. So as we turn the page, we see them sitting in the living room, and they're drinking some kind of warm beverage, and Corrigan is saying, "Nice place. I've never been inside a doctor's house before." And Alice replies, "My husband's working late tonight. Should I call the hospital and let him know you're here?" And Corrigan answers, "I didn't drop by to see your husband, Alice. I came to talk about your baby." And right as he says that, we get a panel where you can see that she does look like she's pregnant. And of course, she's startled by this, and she says, "My baby? What do you mean?" And then Corrigan stands up, and he says, "The lump inside you isn't human, sweetheart. At least, it won't be for long." And this, of course, makes her more on edge, so she drops the carafe, and she says, "Not human? What are you talking about? Get out of my house!" But as she's saying this, some weird supernatural green mist starts to appear around Corrigan, and he says, "You don't get it, sister. This isn't a threat." And then his human form changes into the Spectre. If you don't know what the Spectre looks like, he kind of floats in midair. He has very, very pale white skin, and all he wears is a green Speedo and green boots and a green cloak. And he says to her,
"I have no power over you at this moment, Alice Holland. Indeed, I have no special knowledge of the future. I am only here to deliver a message The child forming within you is a monster. 50 years hence, your son will arise and destroy the world. You must terminate this pregnancy before it is too late. Heed my words, or millions will die. This is your final warning. Neither you nor your son will see me again. An older power shall be the agent of his doom.
And with those final words, the Spectre just disappears in a puff of green smoke, and he leaves Alice sitting in the living room, freaking out about what just happened. But of course, we do know that she didn't listen to the Spectre because Alec Holland was born. And as we turn the page, we cut to present day, where the bar is on fire, and we see people running out and firemen trying to put out the blaze, and all the government agents have the building surrounded. And we see the name of this issue is Amsterdamnation, which I guess is a mashup of the words Amsterdam and damnation. Then we cut inside of the building, and it's exactly where we left off in the last issue, with Colonel Strong pointing his flamethrower at Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing seems to be kind of out of it. He can't really move or respond, but there is a woman from the bar who was wrapped up in his vines that is caught in between Swamp Thing and Colonel Strong. And Colonel Strong says to her, "Get out of the way! I can't get a clear shot!" But she can't really move because she's wrapped in vines, but apparently she's not that hurt from him because she tries to plead for Swamp Thing, saying, "Don't shoot! He hasn't done anything wrong! He's just sick!" But Colonel Strong doesn't listen. He looks at her and says, "I said, get out of the way!" And then he shoots her with his flamethrower and burns her alive. And I guess seeing her burning horrifically snaps Swamp Thing out of the drug-induced state he was in. So he yells out, "No!" And Nelson likes that and he says, "Don't get squeamish, asshole. You're next." And this angers Swamp Thing. So he says, "You do not understand who you are dealing with." And then a bunch of vines shoot out from Swamp Thing's body, but they go underground, like under the floorboards of this bar. And they begin heaving up the floor, which throws Nelson off balance. And he yells, "Jesus Christ!" And then he falls over. And then Swamp Thing moves past him to the open door, and he tries to plead with the other government agents outside, saying, "Please, there has been a terrible mistake. I do not want to hurt anyone." But the government agents don't listen. We just see one of them yell the orders, "Launch the first trap, now!" And the weapons that the men have aren't normal, like firearms. They're wearing these big tanks that have sprayers attached to them. So they spray Swamp Thing with whatever's inside of those, and they cover him completely with this liquid. And Swamp Thing is instantly on the ground, writhing in pain. And the soldiers surround him, and one of them says, "Jesus, that defoliant shit's eating right through him." And another one says, "He's hurting real bad, men. Let's finish him off." But just as they're about to spray him again, Colonel Strong bursts through their ranks and says, "No, get away from him." And the men are kind of confused, but Colonel Strong gives his reasons, saying, "You're in no shape to tackle the monster. I've waited 50 years for this bastard. This is my fight." And I'm not exactly sure how, but while he was talking, Swamp Thing was able to run past them and out into the street. And it's a pretty busy street outside because we see a bunch of cars going through the lanes. And Swamp Thing is trying to plead with Colonel Strong as he runs. So he's looking back and he's yelling, "I do not want to fight anyone. I can't even see." But just as he says that, he turns with a scared look on his face as the bright light from a train or a bus blinds him. And it's too late for Swamp Thing. He can't get out of the way. So he gets hit by it and it tears his body in half. So now his body is just lying on the ground, torn in half. And you can see all these like bubbles and stuff coming up from the defoliant that is still eating away at his body. And government agents surround him. And as his body is melting, he looks up at them and says, "Please help me. I'm very sick." But just as he says that, Colonel Strong pushes past his men and he points his flamethrower at Swamp Thing and he says, "He's down. Burn the piece of shit." And flames shoot out of his gun. We don't actually see them hit Swamp Thing yet, because we turn the page and we cut to South America. And we see we're back at the bar where at the beginning of this run, the scientist Alec Holland first met one of the mysterious three men named L. Blake. And we cut inside of this bar and we see L. Blake is actually talking to another of the three mysterious men, Don Roberto. And Don Roberto says, "What troubles you, Blake? You look worried, huh?" And Blake replies, "Something bad dropping from the heavens, Don Roberto. Our plans for Alec Holland are turning to smoke.
And Roberto says, I do not understand. There is no one with the authority to stand in our way. For 1 billion years, this ritual has been planned. And Blake replies,
Something older has spoken, Don Roberto. The hooded man thinks our plans might threaten the heavens themselves.
And Roberto says, The Spectre has no jurisdiction over elemental matters. This does not concern him. And Blake replies,
I'm not talking about the Spectre, Don Roberto. I'm talking about the Word.
And at the mention of that name, Don Roberto takes a drink from his bottle and says, Oh, God. And Blake continues,
I hear these ancient forces are bound by forgotten laws. Some say they can be stopped if you beat them in a game of cards.
And Roberto doesn't like the sound of that, so he says, But Blake, do you not understand what he can do if you lose? And as he asks this, the bartender actually looks and sees the clock is about to hit midnight, and he calls out to Blake saying,
Midnight draws closer, El Señor Blake. Your opponent will be here soon.
So it seems that Señor Blake has already put his plans in motion. He plans to battle someone named the Word, who is apparently very powerful. And this battle is going to take place in the form of a game of cards. And Roberto is very alarmed by this because he didn't think that it was going to happen right now. He just thought they were talking about the idea. So he says to Blake, I don't believe this. Nobody can challenge the Word. And Blake says to him,
You must go, Don Roberto. I can smell him on the wind. This place is safe no longer.
So Don Roberto gets up to leave, and he says to Blake, Good luck. I hope you know what you're doing. And Blake replies,
Don't worry, Don Roberto. I have many tricks up my sleeve.
And as he says this, we cut to the outside where a hooded man is walking through the jungle towards this bar. And we can't see the face inside of the cloak. We can only see black where his face is. And also, we can't see inside of the cloak. We can just see black. But the cloak and the gloves that we can see he's wearing are a deep red color. And those hands are holding a large book. Then we turn the page and we cut back to Swamp Thing and Colonel Strong. And it seems that Colonel Strong did shoot the flamethrower at Swamp Thing. And as the flames shoot out, he yells,
Burn in hell, you son of a bitch!
And even though the last time we saw Swamp Thing, his body was torn in half by the vehicle that hit him, somehow it seems he was able to grow back his legs. So as the flames hit him and he begins to burn, he's able to stand up and run away. And as he does this, some more soldiers join Colonel Strong and they begin spraying Swamp Thing with flamethrowers as well. And as Swamp Thing runs, he yells,
Get away from me! I don't want to hurt anyone!
But Colonel Strong actually encourages his men to keep spraying, saying,
That's the way, boys! Keep those flamethrowers trained on him!
But luckily, Swamp Thing is in Amsterdam where there's lots of water canals. So as he's running, he's able to make it to the edge of one of these canals and he jumps off into the water, which put all the flames out, luckily, and his body sinks to the bottom where it seems like he's just waiting and regenerating. And we could hear one of the soldiers yelling above saying, We've lost him, Colonel. He's made it to the canal. And as we turn the page, we see Swamp Thing did actually recover down there. His body was able to repair itself because he does surface and he begins swimming to the other side of the canal. And Colonel Strong sees this and he yells to his men,
Come on! He's heading straight into my final trap!
And one of the soldiers actually kind of talks back to Colonel Strong saying, What if he stays underwater, Colonel Strong? He might be able to escape into the sea. But Colonel Strong snaps back,
He'll do as I planned, boy. He's tired of running. My guess is he'll stand and fight.
And it seems Colonel Strong was right, because as Swamp Thing gets to the other side of the canal, he pulls himself out of the water, and as Colonel Strong and his men run across the bridge to try to get to Swamp Thing's side, it seems like Swamp Thing is kind of powering up, and the men yell out, Oh shit! And Strong says,
Get ready for the final attack! Here he comes!
And it seems by now Swamp Thing's body has fully recovered from the defoliant and getting hit by the train, and he's tired of running, so he stands up to face Colonel Strong, who says to him,
Come on, asshole! I'm ready for you! I've waited all my life for this!
And Swamp Thing fires back,
I do not know why you hate me so much, but if I die here, I am taking you with me!
But unbeknown to Swamp Thing, this is the area from last issue that we saw Colonel Strong setting up his big trap. And if you remember, that had something to do with liquid nitrogen. So it's some sort of freezing trap. And unfortunately, when Swamp Thing pulled himself up onto this side of the canal, he did not see the many things that kind of look like freeze rays that were surrounding the area. So now he's kind of standing in the middle of them, and Colonel Strong yells out,
Okay, boys,
Go for it! Freeze the bastard! And they follow orders, so they push the button, and all of a sudden, all the freeze rays shoot out at Swamp Thing, and it totally works. They actually do freeze Swamp Thing where he stands, so Swamp Thing's body is encapsulated inside of a big block of ice. And Colonel Strong calmly walks over and admires his work, and he says to the other men, "You can come out now. The hunt's over. I've won again." And one of the other soldiers comes over and looks at the ice block of Swamp Thing, and he says, "Jesus, look at him." And Nelson begins to tap on the ice block with his knuckles, showing how he's won and that Swamp Thing is no longer a threat. And he turns to his men and says, "Here's your killer, boys. Hard to believe this dumb piece of shit killed 60 Cajuns." Then Colonel Strong lights his pipe, and he begins to smoke, and he turns to one of the other men and says, "Get my chainsaw. I'm taking his head for my wall. You boys can cut off anything else you want as a souvenir." But the man doesn't say anything. He's just staring at the ice block with a look of fear on his face. So Nelson notices that there was no response, so he turns to the man and says, "Are you deaf, man? I said, get me my chainsaw from the Jeep." But there is a reason why that man can't say anything, and we see what that reason is as we turn the page, and we see vines beginning to grow out of the man's mouth, and they begin to sprout tulips. And then all the men that are surrounding Swamp Thing begin sprouting these flowers until their bodies completely explode with tulips bursting out of them. But Nelson Strong is unaffected. He's just watching this in horror, yelling, "Jesus Christ!" Then we get a panel of Swamp Thing in the ice block, and he's not moving, but we get some narration from him that says, "Each and every body buckles and heaves, blood-red tulips blossoming from the pores and tattooed flesh. Tiny spores lodged in their skin for hours take root and feed on their natural minerals, calcium, magnesium, nitrogen. Their twitching bodies are fertile grounds to plunder, lush gardens to suck dry." And this is actually a callback to the last issue, because if you remember, while they were setting up this freeze ray trap, Colonel Strong, as he was explaining to his men what was going to happen, was interrupted by a woman walking by selling tulips. So I guess as she walked by, the spores from those tulips wafted in the wind and landed on all these soldiers' bodies. And that is why Swamp Thing is using tulips here to kill them. And as more soldiers show up, their bodies also begin to explode in these tulips. And interestingly, and out of character for what we've seen from him, Colonel Strong begins to plead with Swamp Thing, saying, "No, you're killing them." And we can even see that there's a helicopter flying above from the government, and those pilots are even sprouting tulips, and they die, and that helicopter begins to crash. And it looks like it's going to fall directly on top of Colonel Strong. So as it's coming down, we get some more narration from Swamp Thing that says, "There is no other way. They left me no choice. It makes it easier to know that they are evil men, and evil men belong in hell." Then the helicopter smashes into the ground on top of Colonel Strong and bursts into flames. But surprisingly, Colonel Strong does not die in this explosion. He's just trapped underneath it. And as he tries to pull himself out from the wreckage, he says, "It's not fair. I didn't know he could do this stuff. I'll rip his heart out. But he's cut off as Swamp Thing cuts in saying, "You won't kill anything ever again." And as Colonel Strong looks over his shoulder, he sees Swamp Thing standing above him, lifting the bus that struck him earlier over his head, and the last words of Colonel Strong are, "Oh shit," as Swamp Thing swings the bus over his head and smashes down on top of Colonel Strong, killing him. And he is definitely dead because we see blood splatter coming out from underneath it, and the only thing that didn't get smushed is his left hand. And as Swamp Thing limps away, we do see crowds gathering of the townspeople, and they're just kind of looking in shock at what just happened. And Swamp Thing's narration says, "The crowd stand and stare with morbid fascination, and the air is filled with perfume and burning pork. I have wasted enough time in this terrible city. It's time to go to a better place." Then we kind of zoom in on Colonel Strong's hand, and then we cut to black, and we hear Colonel Strong ask, "Where am I?" And someone answers, "Do not be alarmed, Nelson Strong. You are among friends. We have awaited your arrival for 1 billion years." And Colonel Strong asks, "Who are you?" And the voice answers, "We are those who have always been and always will be.
we have selected you as our champion. Welcome to the Parliament of Stones.
Then we turn the page and we cut to a semi-truck that is being pulled over at the Dutch border. And the officer that stopped the truck walks over to the window and says, "Okay, stop the truck. We'd like to take a look around." And the driver sticks his head out the window and says, "What's the problem? I haven't done anything wrong." And the officer answers, "Cargo check, sir. Every main road is blocked. Nobody can get in or out without a pass until we locate the swamp monster." And then the driver gets very serious and says, "A supervillain killed a friend of mine a few years back. He was in the United States on holiday, and some bastard dropped a hotel on him. I hope you find this punk. I really do." Then we cut to underneath the truck, and we can see Swamp Thing is holding on to the bottom of it, so he's hitched a ride on the bottom of this semi-truck to get across the border. Then we hear one of the other officers that was searching the back of the truck yell, "Nothing hidden in back, Sergeant. All clear." So the sergeant goes over to the gate arm and he lifts it up for the truck and he says, "Okay, sir, you're free to go. Drive carefully now." Then we turn the page and we cut to Colonel Strong's house, where we see Major North is walking with the butler of Colonel Strong. And we see the butler, Mr. Haney, is carrying something that's in a bag on a plate. And Major North is saying to him, "I'm sorry it took so long to get this, Mr. Haney. It was such an unusual request." Then we see the men walk into Nelson Strong's trophy room, and Mr. Haney approaches the wall with all the different heads of all the monsters that Nelson Strong had killed over the years. And Haney says to North, "Master Nelson saved a special place in his games room for a most coveted trophy, Major North. He reserved this space for the greatest monster of them all." Then he fiddles with the bag, and we can't really see what's in it, but he removes whatever it is, and he hangs it on the wall right in the spot where Swamp Thing's head was going to go. And he says, "There." And then he backs away, and we see what he's put on the wall, and he has mounted Colonel Strong's head in the center of this trophy wall. And as he backs away looking at it, he says, "I believe it's what he would have wanted." Then as we turn the page, we cut to a flashback of Colonel Strong as a boy, and if you remember, a couple issues back, he had been talking about the time he ate a bunch of mushrooms, and while he was tripping, the Parliament of Stones revealed to him that he would be killed by Swamp Thing, which led him on this journey of trying to find and kill Swamp Thing his entire life. So we cut to 1945 England in this flashback where we see what happened the morning after his trip as he's woken up by all the adults looking for him from the night before. And we hear a doctor say, "His pupils are contracting. It looks like Nelson's back in the real world." And the doctor's light flashing in his eyes wakes him up. So Nelson sits up and says, "Where am I? What's going on?" And the doctor says to him, "I think your parents might ask you the same question, young man. You were warned never to eat those wild mushrooms." And his mom, who was trailing behind, runs over to him very concerned, and it seems that something's wrong because she says, "Oh God, look at him. My baby's hair. It's turned white." But the father, who's kind of a traditional man from the 40s, says, "Take it easy, honey. Dr. Pym says everything's going to be okay. Nelson just had a bad fright." But Nelson looks at them kind of scared and says, "But the Green Man and the games room and the Parliament of Stones, it was all so real, Dad. I really thought my head had been cut off." And then the dad comes over to his son and puts his coat around him and says, "Slow down, little guy. I guess it was all just a dream. The doctor said you're lucky you didn't poison yourself." But Nelson says back to his dad, "It wasn't a dream, Dad. I could touch them." But his parents, of course, don't really believe him because they think he was just tripping. So the dad says to Mom and Nelson, "Come on, let's go home before it gets dark." So in kind of a cool twist, everything we saw happen between Swamp Thing and Nelson Strong with the fight in Amsterdam is exactly what Nelson Strong saw as a boy when he was tripping on mushrooms. Even the stuff that happened after he was dead, like the mounting of his head on the wall. Then we turn the page and we cut to the mysterious red figure known as the Word. And he's still standing outside in the jungle, and he has not gone into the bar yet to play cards with Señor Blake. And as he stands there, he's just reading aloud from his book, and he says, "And so, the little boy who was afraid of the dark grew up to be the hunter who slept with the light on, the mortal man who became the champion of the Parliament of Stones." And then he claps the large book shut, and a bunch of dust comes out of it, and he says, "Here endeth my story." Then we cut to inside the bar where Señor Blake is waiting for him, and we see Señor Blake look down at his watch, and it is now reading midnight. And then a knock comes on the door, and we see now that the entire bar is empty, including like the bartender and everyone. It seems that all of them are scared of the word as well. So Blake calls out and says, "Come inside and do no harm. El Señor Blake is ready for you." So the word enters, and he doesn't open the door, he just walks through it. And now we can see his shape better because it's not covered in shadow. But basically, he looks exactly like the Spectre, but he's wearing red. So his skin's all white and pale, but instead of a green cloak, gloves, and boots, they're red. So he walks over to Señor Blake, and Blake just stares at him, so the word says, "Bow your head, and be grateful I have granted you this opportunity to save your toy. The word is not prone to making bargains with your kind." And Señor Blake replies, "I'm grateful, hooded man." And then the word removes his cloak so we can see his face, and he says, "Make no mistake, Señor Blake. If fate decrees that you should lose this game, then I shall crush the elemental. No one may rise to challenge the word and escape my wrath." And after that warning, the word sits down at the table, and Señor Blake begins shuffling cards, and Señor Blake says to him, "I understand the stakes, and I respect your laws, hooded man. Now, let's begin our game." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And we had some cool revelations this time. We kind of suspected it, but Nelson Strong is definitely going to be the champion of the Parliament of Stones. But we'll have to wait until next time to see what happens with that. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.